Hi, East Debaters! In this video, I'm going to be going over the speech order and times for a debate. And if you were at practice on Friday, you should have gotten a handout that has a list of all the speech orders and times and some other information about that. I would highly recommend that you grab that sheet of paper and have that in front of you during this video because I think it'll help to follow along with it. So with that, we're going to just go in the order of the speeches and talk a little bit about what each one is about. So starting with the 1AC. The 1AC stands for First Affirmative Constructive. The affirmative team always starts off the debate, and they have 8 minutes to talk about their case. So a 1AC would include a plan, so they would state what plan that they're advocating. It would include advantages. It would include other components of a case that we're going to talk about a little bit later. And it will also include a lot of evidence. So this is a speech in which the affirmative team gets to quote from a bunch of different sources to support their case and introduce all that evidence into the debate. The next speech that happens is cross-ex. So cross-examination is a period where one team gets to ask the other team questions. And so sometimes it can get really confusing about like who's supposed to be doing what in cross-ex. The way I remember this is the person who just spoke, so the person who gave the 1AC, they are the one who is answering the questions. If you just gave a speech that's a constructive, you answer questions about it for 3 minutes afterwards. Now, who asks the questions? And that's the part that's a little bit trickier. It's always the person on the opposing side who is not giving the next speech. So in this case, you have the second negative speaker ask the questions of the first affirmative speaker. And the reason for that is the next speech that's coming up is the 1NC, the first negative constructive. And so the first negative speaker, the 1N, is getting ready to give that speech. They don't have time to ask a bunch of questions because that is time that they should be using to make sure their speech is ready. So the 2N asks the 1A questions in this first cross-ex period, and that's 3 minutes. The next speech, as I've mentioned, the 1NC, the first negative constructive. In this speech, the negative is going to present all of the arguments that they want to have in the debate. So usually this will include 1 or 2 disadvantages. So if you recall from the advantages and disadvantages video that you may have seen or that we talked about at practice, there might be, say the affirmative case is that we should require the NSA to get a warrant for their surveillance. A disadvantage might be the terrorism disadvantage. They might also read the politics disadvantage. So we'll say that those are the 2 disadvantages the negative brings up. And then they're going to make some defensive arguments. So they're going to attack the affirmative's case and attack their advantages in the 1NC. Now, again, after the 1NC, which is 8 minutes, all constructives are 8 minutes, so you'll see a pattern emerge here. We have another cross-ex period. In this cross-ex, the 1N, who just gave the 1NC, they are going to be asked questions by the 1A. So the 1N just spoke, they answer the questions. The 1AC, the 1A is not giving the next speech, not giving the next affirmative speech, so they ask the questions in this cross-ex, which is 3 minutes. Next, we have the 2AC, so second affirmative constructive. And you have the second affirmative speaker giving that speech, also 8 minutes. So in this speech, even though it's considered a constructive speech, you're still going to have responses to the negative's arguments. So just because it's a constructive doesn't mean you don't respond to the arguments. So what the 2AC is going to do is they are going to first talk about their case, they're going to talk about their advantages, and then they're going to respond to the negative's disadvantages. And so it'll include both of that. Also, this speech, like the 1NC and like the 1AC, all of it includes evidence. They get to quote from sources. They get to bring a lot of that into the debate. Again, another cross-ex period. The 2A, who just gave the 2AC, answers the questions. The 1N, so the person who gave the 1NC, they ask the questions because they're not giving the second negative speech. So 2A answers, 1N asks the questions for 3 minutes. next we have the 2NC, so the second negative constructive. Now, I'm going to bring up the speech after that, which is the 1NR, because we need to think about these two speeches as one big speech together. These, as you'll see, the negative in the middle of the debate gives two speeches in a row. It's kind of weird, huh, isn't it? But it's just the way it is, and so we have to start adapting in the negative block, which is what this is called. So think of it, it's big block, big rectangle, negative block, these two speeches together, and they don't make the same arguments in the speech. And that's the most important thing you should understand. And if you do make the same arguments, that's called double covering. And what does that do? It shrinks the size of your speech. Your speech should be able to cover this many arguments, but if you double cover, you're essentially making your own speech shorter because you're not taking full advantage of that time you have. So never double cover. That's like fundamental novice lesson number 1, never double cover. And if your opponents double cover, then they are being noobs and you are much better than them. So don't do that. Make sure you make different arguments. So let's go back to our 1NC. We said that the affirmative case had a disadvantage of terrorism and that it had political ramifications that were bad. So maybe the 2NC could talk about the terrorism disadvantage and the 1NR could talk about the politics disadvantage. That's a way to split the block, never double cover. So I sort of oversimplified this a little bit because it's not really one big speech. The 2NC doesn't stand up and then immediately after the 1N stands up. No, there's a cross-ex period in between. So after the 2NC, there's cross-ex for 3 minutes before the 1NR begins. In this cross-ex, the 2A, the second affirmative speaker, asks questions of the 2N who just spoke. Now, the 1NR, I should mention, stands for first negative rebuttal. However, now, rebuttal speeches are different than constructive speeches because they normally do not include evidence. So normally in a rebuttal, you're not going to be reading new quotations from authors. You're not going to be, you're only going to be referencing evidence previously read in the debate. You're not going to be making a whole bunch of new arguments. Now, the 1NR is a little bit of a different case because, like we mentioned before, it's put together with the 2NC to make the negative block. And so in the 1NR, you still can read evidence, and that's perfectly acceptable to do. So we'll talk more about this later, but just know that this is a special rebuttal that's a lot more like a constructive than it is like an actual rebuttal. All right, so now that we're finished with the 1NR, we have the 1AR. So and of course, rebuttals are 5 minutes long. Should have mentioned that before. So you're the 1AR. You are the first affirmative speaker. You have to get up and answer a 13-minute negative block. 2NC spoke, the 1NR spoke. They've been talking and talking and talking and talking. You've got to get up and answer all of that in 5 minutes. It's kind of a hard speech, but it's doable. And the way you do a good job in the 1AR is you are time efficient and you make choices about what arguments you want to go for, right? There's probably a lot of ways as the affirmative team we could respond to the terrorism disadvantage, right? Maybe the NSA isn't a credible source. Maybe terrorism is a pretty low threat. Maybe surveillance techniques don't actually work. But in the 1AR, we need to pick and choose our arguments because we don't have time to say every possible thing that we could say. We have to only go for the best arguments. So that's the 1AR. We have to both make arguments about our own advantages, and then we have to respond to the negatives, disadvantages. But picking and choosing arguments is key, and to be able to cover all the arguments in the speech. Now, as you'll notice, we're in the rebuttal section of the debate now, so there's no more cross-ex periods. We're just giving speeches after each other. So, second to last speech in the debate, the 2NR, second negative rebuttal. This speech usually we'll pick one disadvantage to focus on. Usually they're not going to go for both because, again, this is a 5-minute speech. It's pretty short, and so you don't have time to cover every argument you made in the first negative constructive. So you're going to pick and choose arguments both to respond to the affirmative advantages and your own disadvantages, and you're going to explain those arguments and elaborate on them. But again, you're not going to be reading new evidence or quoting a whole bunch of sources. You're just going to be explaining and responding to the affirmative arguments. Explaining your own arguments and responding to the affirmatives. And then last, we've got the 2AR, the second affirmative rebuttal, 5 minutes long. Your job is to prove that your case is a good idea. It's to explain your advantages, compare them to the negatives and disadvantages, and to, again, pick arguments that you think are the most responsive to the negative. It's 5 minutes long. Absolutely no new arguments in this speech. It's the last speech in the debate. If you make new arguments, most judges are going to get very angry with you because the other team doesn't have time to respond. So you have to be careful and make sure you're really tying everything back to the beginning of the debate rather than saying a whole bunch of new stuff. All right, I know that was a lot. I know that's confusing. If it helps to rewatch the video and look at that sheet of paper, I definitely recommend it. Luckily, in a debate, you're always going to be able to have your notes that say what the speech order is, who's supposed to say what. You can bring that up with you. It's, don't feel like you have to memorize this. Now, one last thing I want to talk about is speaker position. So you're like, there's all these numbers and all these like A's and C's and R's. Like, what does that even mean? Okay, so in any debate, so on the affirmative side, there's two positions. There's the 2A and the 1A. Stands for second affirmative and first affirmative. And those positions correspond with the speeches. So if you're the 1A, the first affirmative speaker, you give the first affirmative constructive and the first affirmative rebuttal. That's the 1A. If you are the 2A, you give the second affirmative constructive and the second affirmative rebuttal. But now remember that you're not always going to be affirmative, you will also be negative, right? So then if we switch to the negative side, you also have two positions. You have the 1N, so first negative constructive, first negative rebuttal, and you have the 2N, the second negative constructive, and the second negative rebuttal. Now, since you switch sides and you have one partner, that means that you have to pick a side. You have to pick a position on the affirmative side that you want to be and a position on the negative side that you want to be. And on my team and on most other teams, the way we have somebody be the 2 on one side and the 1 on the other side. So you would be the 2A 1N or the 1A 2N. And another thing that's interesting that when I was a novice I didn't understand was that the 2 on each side is I hesitate to say more important position, but the closer on each argument, or on each side. So the 2A is like the captain of the aft ship, the 2N is the captain of the neg ship. So if you like being affirmative more, you should probably be the 2A. If you like being negative more, you should be the 2N 1A. So 2A 1N, 2N 1A. And I just want you to start thinking about what speaker position might fit you better. And we'll figure that out a little bit down the road. But hopefully this helps, and I'll see you all at practice.